found this. This is an organization that was founded to unite Americans across party lines. We determined that there are lots of Americans in both the Republican and Democratic parties who actually share traditional conservative values and are tired of the exciseness of the country. They want to put an end to the overseas interventions. They want to restore the rule of law, crack down on the criminality inside the country, secure our borders. That includes ultimately is securing our ports, littoral waters, and rounding up and expelling the illegals. Electoral integrity is a big issue, and finally stopping the sexualization of our children. Those are the basic issues, and that's where we try to focus most of our attention and resources. Well, those, as you said, Congress is really me first, and then everything else that you mentioned and comes next is a function of to the extent to which the individuals are rewarded for their support financially. Remember, you've got a House of Representatives where people serve for 2 years, which means they spend 50+% of their time trying to be reelected. They're starved for money. And so anyone that comes up and says, look, if you'll support me, I'm the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, or I'm the advocate for country X or whatever, then we can put additional funds into your political action committee and help you with your reelection. That gets a lot of attention. And that's how Washington runs the Senate a little bit better, though no less greedy. In fact, more greedy, probably. But they're there for 6 years, so they're not constantly trying to be reelected, but they certainly don't miss the opportunity to enrich themselves. Well, you can certainly use the word racket. I would start at the top with the simple statement that we have no national strategy. National strategy involves military power. It involves economic development. It involves cultivating good relations for the purposes of commerce and business overseas, and you go down the list. Grand strategy consists of many, many things, including, of course, development of technology and its integration into society and the military. We really don't have that. What we have are a set of loosely defined interests, and we're driven by those. And those interests are not always national interests. For instance, I would argue that we have no national strategic interest per se in eastern Ukraine. The only interest we've ever had in Ukraine was to promote peace and stability in the region, which is something we haven't done. In fact, we've done the opposite. And in the Middle East, we certainly don't have any interest in cultivating regional war against Israel and the United States. But again, we've set those things aside in favor of what I would call current interests or financially rewarding interests or both. That means the flavor of the month is we're all going to rush claim that Ukraine is some pristine democracy and that we all have an obligation to defend it against the evil Russians, who are some version of what they were under the Soviet Union or whatever nonsense it makes. No sense. There's no one in charge. There's no one in the White House per se, as far as I can tell, and the people who are there are simply riding this ship of state wherever it takes them. So we're in a lot of trouble as a nation. We don't really define our fundamental interests, and we don't essentially link means and ends. We have no sense of limitations. We think our resources are unlimited, and they're not. Oh, I think we've been in trouble for a long time. You've got to go back and consider that, certainly up until World War I.E., with the possible exception of the Spanish-American War, which was a war we could have avoided and subsequently regretted for various reasons. But really, up until World War I.E., we were a nation that focused preeminently on building prosperity at home and pursuing peace abroad. In other words, the formula for success for the United States was if we build our economic foundation well, we raise our standard of living, and we cultivate the emergence of an educated, intelligent, hard-working population that the rest of the world will notice, and they'll want to imitate us. They'll want to admire us. And there was nothing in the Constitution or in the minds of the people that founded this country about intervening in other people's affairs. In fact, when Thomas Jefferson suggested that we should join with the Revolutionary French at the time, as you know, under Napoleon, and to help them spread their revolution across the world, especially in Europe. Washington and Hamilton, who both liked Jefferson's, concluded that Jefferson had lost his mind. And Washington made the point that no nation can be expected to move beyond the limits of its own interests. We had no interest in spreading revolution anywhere. We had only one interest overriding strategic interest, and that was to secure the North American continent so that English-speaking people conquered and ruled the nation from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that within that framework. We would have a reply that was somewhat democratic, although not as much as people think, and it was designed to promote stability and peace. And your entire Constitution simply tells the American people what the government may not do to them. That's very important. That's it. There's nothing else like it in human history. These constitutions are all about the powers of the state. Well, our Constitution describes in great detail what the state may not do to us. We've lost touch with all of that, and by essentially signing on for these wars of intervention, go back to Vietnam, we certainly went there under false pretenses and deluded ourselves into believing that we were somehow or another spreading democracy and the new liberal order, or whatever you want to call it, by killing 2 million Vietnamese. But that didn't work out very well, and we lost a lot of credibility as a result of that. We then worked to bring it back, and we finally did, I think, regain a lot of credibility, particularly in 1991, not just for military reasons, but the way we handled it diplomatically. Our insistence that this was not a war of conquest, that we were not interested in the next thing or holding on to Iraq or anything else. We were simply trying to remove it as a danger to the world's oil concentration and keep the oil flowing. That was it, really. So as a result, we were in pretty good shape then. We started this business of intervention after the fall or the collapse of the Soviet state system. We began diluting ourselves and to believe that we were the indispensable nation, that our rights, our values were universal, and they never were and never will be. We lost eye respect for other people's countries, other people's national interests, other people's cultures, and way of life. It's been a disaster. Well, I think what we've got in with regard to Israel is somewhat different set of circumstances. Israel was founded after the Second World War, came into existence as a state largely because Harry Truman breathed life into it, and the rationale at the time was twofold. 1. The Jews just endured this horrible Holocaust. 6 million were systematically murdered, either in camps or across Eastern Europe. And then secondly, because Harry Truman's political advisors told him that if you recognize the independence of the State of Israel, we will have unlimited quantities of money at our disposal for the Democratic Party in perpetuity. Now it turns out that they were wrought, largely correct. Enormous quantities of Jewish money have been poured into various political entities in the United States to maintain this relationship and sustained effectively Israel's stature and influence inside the United States, and that's worked very well. But at this point, we're a little different than we were, say, 2030, 40, 50 years ago. If you go back through Israel's previous campaigns, previous wars, Israel was always restrained by presidents who intervened, as Eisenhower did in 56, and said, "We're not going to underwrite your conquest of the Suez," in other words, of the Sinai Peninsula, and the Israelis had come into the Suez Project along with the British and the French, who were interested in regaining control of Suez Canal, and Eisenhower threw them out and said no, and you Israelis cannot have the Sinai Peninsula again. In 1967, Lyndon Johnson supported them. However, Lyndon Johnson also emphasized that there were boundaries to the extent of support he was prepared to offer. Finally, you got Richard Nixon in 1973, when the Israelis initially were attacked by the Egyptians, and the Syrians managed to throw them back. The Egyptians were the toughest nut to crack, because they had simply crossed the canal and set up a defense, had not tried to maneuver. And the Israelis had enormous difficulties with that defense. But eventually they broke through and managed to cross the Suez Canal and come in behind the Egyptians. When that happened, Richard Nixon made it clear that's unacceptable. You're going to have to pull back across the Suez Canal, but we won't be able to negotiate an end to this. we might end up at war with Russia. And so the Israelis eventually withdrew and retired back behind the Suez Canal. And we got the Camp David Accords and built, at least for the past 50 years, a very good relationship between Egypt and Israel. Well, here we are.